Okay, so today I'm going to take you through a film that we made in 2019 featuring George Clooney and astronaut Charlie Duke. It's called The Longest Minute, and I'll explain where the title comes from later. And I thought it might be fun to take you through how we made the film and show you some of the behind the scenes. Let's jump in. Okay, so we started off in the control desk exhibition room, which is not normally accessible by the public, but we were given special access to shoot our film in. So I think it's worth noting that we would start off with a little bit of establishing stuff up front. So we've put a couple of notes about Charlie and what his role was. All of those desks that you see in the background are all original control desks that were used during the Apollo missions. All right, so we've got Charlie and George meeting here for the first time, which was great because they'd never met before. This was all done for real, so their actions were completely natural.
I can still pass the physical. But NASA says, don't call us, I'll call you.
They won't let you up there now.
Brown, you got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
It's your voice that says, a bunch of guys turning blue down
We were
here.
really lucky to have Charlie, do this because he has got direct experience walking on the moon, but he's also the guy that was communicating with the Apollo 11 crew when they were landing on the moon.
Well, I mean, when I saw that on my console as CAPCOM, I said, we're dead in the water.
So what most people don't know is that as the astronauts were coming in to land on the lunar surface, a whole bunch of errors started going off with the computer system, and that's what Charlie's talking about. The other thing to know, of course, is that although George is a brand ambassador for Omega and he was paid to be here, he was also a genuine space fan because he was about 9 or 10 when the Apollo program was active. So these astronauts were like his childhood heroes. So he was really, really pleased to meet Charlie and to be able to ask him questions.
So I called Eagle 60 seconds.
60 seconds. 60 seconds. Lights on.
30 seconds later, I called Eagle 30 seconds.
Oh man, I just love all those little blinking lights and dials and things on those desks. They're so tactile. You can just imagine people sitting there and pushing knobs and picking up those old telephone receivers. It must have been great. It was also really interesting to hear Charlie talking about Neil Armstrong because he was clearly a very, very focused person and he wasn't going to let that mission fail.
Very, very tense in mission control.
The other cool thing about Charlie was how humble he was. I mean, he got so much respect from the people in the local area. When we were moving around locations, for example, we'd often bump into military personnel of some sort, and they would just stop in their tracks and salute Charlie as he came by. They had so much respect for him.
But had we gotten to that point, I'm convinced Neil Armstrong would have said, "Say again, Houston."
Just gone.
He would have landed because he had.
Say again, Houston. It sounds like they had a really good relationship.
The Eagle has landed.
We choose to go to the moon.
So this is the famous speech that John F. Kennedy did at Rice University, which is essentially what started off, the Apollo program and the space race, because they were essentially competing with the Russians, to get to the moon first.
15 minutes in space, and he's going to go to the moon in 8.5 years. But I look back now, George, and the most amazing thing was 8 years and 2 months later, I'm sitting in mission control talking to Neil Armstrong when he landed. He did it.
I mean, it's just an incredible accomplishment. This stands out as one of the greats of all time.
Just a note about the styling on this film. We decided to make it black and white because it sort of fit the 1960s scientific look a little better. But there's these little flashes of gold, which are the reference to the golden anniversary, seeing that it was 50 years since the moon landing. We mixed in a lot of archive footage, of course, and then we try to recreate some of those scenes that sort of felt like they were from the 60s, but especially because the Speedmaster is essentially unchanged. It was one of the props that we didn't need to find or recreate.
And you left a picture of your family.
I did. One of the final.
He must have been in his mid-30s when he was CAPCOM, and then he later walked on the moon himself with Apollo 16. When he landed on the moon, he dropped a photograph of him and his family as a sort of memento. And the joke, of course, after decades of being bombarded by UV rays, I'm sure that it's pure white by now. In fact, it's probably worth noting that the American flags that were placed are pure white by now too.
The fascination is that at the time it was the most modern of all things, but you look at it now and you think, Wow.
Yeah. It's good technology, though. I mean, this rocket never had a failure.
This was a great scene. I mean, where else can you walk underneath a Saturn V rocket but the Kennedy Space Center? This really helped put into perspective some of those old archive shots of the rocket launching to be able to understand better just how big that thing is. I believe it's about 36 stories high. And this was a wonderful scene that we had where the two men were walking underneath the rocket, and Charlie was able to describe for George every step of the launch phase. I mean, it's just so big.
And then at what point does it start to hit?
Yeah, so this was great because George could ask questions just like us viewers would, right? We know a little bit about space, but we don't know the details. And so what was fantastic is hearing Charlie rattle off the facts and figures as if they were yesterday. I mean, he could remember how many pounds of fuel they used for each stage and at what velocity they'd be traveling at. Isn't it amazing to be able to hear this first-hand experience from a guy who flew in one of those rockets?
3 days to get you to the moon.
The lunar module.
Yeah, so these are some of the exhibits that you see up in the Space Center. They're all actual parts. That Saturn V rocket that's in there was meant for flight. And it was just that the Apollo program was canceled after, was it Apollo 17? So they never used it in the end, but it was built for flight.
Okay, engine stop. That's one small step for man. One.
You know what was so cool about George, too, is that he let Charlie do all the talking. We had done a little briefing with him up front, of course, and sort of ironed out a few of the things that we want to be talking about. But essentially, George led the interview. He just had such a good feeling for keeping Charlie engaged and keeping the pace moving forward nicely. There's this really good moment coming up where George tells Charlie that he represents the best of us, which I just think is such a great way of putting it, because the moon landing was essentially a world achievement, wasn't it? It wasn't just about the Americans anymore.
Those are those things that make us very proud. You know, you are someone who makes us very proud.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great experience. It was a humbling experience to be involved in the program, especially in mission control. See all of the 400,000 people putting their effort to get those three guys sitting up on top of that rocket, get to the moon, and to return safely.
Get back.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things.
Yeah, I've got to say, this project was absolutely amazing to work on, because although I wasn't involved in the Apollo program directly, it gives me the opportunity to keep these kind of stories alive. When a brand like Omega has this history behind them, we can carry on inspiring people by telling the story in a fresh, new way. And I think it's important to, engage the next generation and to help them understand where they've come from and what could be possible.
Okay. At the foot of the ladder, the limb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very